In 1979, Black Sabbath fired Ozzy Osbourne, the man millions of people thought was the band, and somehow Black Sabbath survived, so did Ozzy. But that was only the beginning, because when Black Sabbath lost its most recognizable voice, something nobody expected happened next. Both sides became legends. What happens when the thing you thought defined you disappears? A band loses its singer. An artist loses the band that made him famous. And suddenly both are forced to answer the same question. Who are you when the thing that made you is gone? To understand that answer, we have to go back to Birmingham. In Birmingham, England, four young musicians were moving through the same working class world that would eventually give heavy metal one of its defining sounds. Tony Iommi had been a mythology. Bill Ward had been there too. Ozzy Osbourne and Geezer Butler had crossed paths in rare breed. In 1968, the musicians came together around a new group that passed through the names including the Polka Tulk, Blues Band and Earth. Then the name changed, Black Sabbath. Iommi had another problem. At 17, an accident at a sheet metal factory took the tips of two fingers on his right hand. For a guitarist, it could have ended everything. Instead, he adopted light strings, altered tuning, fingertip protection, and a new physical relationship with the guitar. The accident did not single-handedly invent heavy metal, but it became part of the physical story behind one of the heaviest guitar sound ever recorded. Iommi on guitar, Geezer Butler on bass, Bill Ward on drums, Ozzy Osbourne on vocals. Four musicians, one chemistry. Geezer's lyrics leaned into a war, religion, fear, death, and the darkest side of the world around them. Iommi built riffs that were slower, heavier, and more ominous than much of the blues rock's vocabulary surrounding them. What made the band feel enormous, and Ozzy gave the music a human voice that sounded strange enough to belong to another world. They were not trying to invent a genre. They were trying to make music that sounded like nothing else around them. And on February 13, 1970, the self-titled Black Sabbath arrived. Then came Paranoid, released in September 1970. It contained War Pigs, Paranoid, Iron Man and Hand of Doom. Paranoid became the breakthrough. Master of Reality followed in 1971. Sweet Leaf, Children of the Grave, Into the Void, then Volume 4 in 1972. Then Sabbath, Bloody Sabbath in 1973. The band was expanding without losing its darkness. By then, Black Sabbath was no longer simply a strange Birmingham band. It was a global force. The classic run continued through Sabotage, Technical, Stasi, and Never Say Die, but the chemistry inside the band was becoming harder to sustain. Success did not make the machine healthier. Drugs and alcohol were no longer just part of the mythology surrounding rock music. They were affecting the people inside the band. The Los Angeles period became a symbol of the collapse. The band had gone to America to work on a new material, but the creative process stalled. Eventually, the problem was no longer whether they could make another great record, it was whether they could function as a band. And then came the decision that changed heavy metal history. In April 1979, Black Sabbath fired Ozzy Osbourne. Bill Ward delivered the news. Ozzy was out. The voice of the classic Black Sabbath era was gone. And the question was brutal. Could Black Sabbath exist without Ozzy? But there was another question nobody outside the band could yet answer. Could Ozzy exist without Black Sabbath? If you are into the stories behind rock and metal's greatest legends, subscribe to Ghost Legion. We have got a lot more in the archive. Tony Iommi found the answer in Ronnie James Dio. Dio had already built a reputation with Rainbow, but his voice gave Black Sabbath an entirely different weapon. More range, more projection, more theatrical power. Heaven and Hell arrived in 1980. It reached number 9 in the United Kingdom and the number 28 on the Billboard 200 in the United States. RIAA records show the album was certified platinum in the United States on May 13, 1986. That is more than critical praise. The reinvention had commercial proof. Then came Mob Rules in 1981. Black Sabbath had survived the impossible, but it was no longer the same band. Ian Gillan of Deep Purple joined for Born Again in 1983. Then came a period of constant change. Seventh Star began as a Tony Iommi solo project before record. Company pressure pushed it into the Black Sabbath name. Glenn Hughes sang. Ray Gillan later recorded vocals for the Eternal Idol before leaving. Tony Martin became one of the most important voices of the post-Ozzy era. The Eternal Idol, Headless Cross, Tired, then Dio returned for Dehumanizer in 1992. Cross Purposes arrived in 1994, Forbidden followed in 1995. These albums are often overshadowed by the Ozzy records, but ignoring them creates an incomplete Black Sabbath story. Because the band became more than a lineup, it became an institution built around Tony Iommi's guitar. While Sabbath rebuilt itself, Ozzy had his own impossible problem. He had lost the band that made him famous. Sharon Arden became central to the next chapter. Then came Randy Rhoads. Blizzard of Oz arrived in 1980. Crazy Train, Mr. Crowley, Suicide Solution, then Diary of Madman. Ozzy was no longer simply the former singer of Black Sabbath. He had become Ozzy Osbourne. Then in 1982, Randy Rhoads was killed in a plane crash. The loss devastated Ozzy and people around him. But the career did not end. Ozzy kept moving. Black Sabbath and Ozzy would cross paths again. The original lineup reunited for major appearances, including the 1992 reunion and the 1997-98 return to the stage. Then decades after the first Black Sabbath record, the original story came back into focus. In 2013, Black Sabbath released 13. Rick Rubin produced it. Brad Wilk played drums on the recording. 13 reached number 1 on the Billboard 200 and number 1 in the United Kingdom. It became the band's first US number 1 album. God Is Dead won the 2014 Grammy Award for Best Metal Performance. After more than 40 years, Black Sabbath had not merely survived, it had returned to the top. Black Sabbath's award record is smaller than its influence might suggest. The band has 2 Grammy wins, Iron Man and God Is Dead. It was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 2006 and the UK Music Hall of Fame in 2005. Official Black Sabbath material says the band has sold more than 75 million albums worldwide, and the influence is difficult to measure. Metallica, Slayer, Iron Maiden, Megadeth, Pantera, Nirvana, Tool, slow riffs, dark imagery, heavy low-end distortion as atmosphere, metal as a world rather than simply a style of guitar playing. In 2025, the story reached its final chapter. Back to the Beginning was staged at Villa Park in Birmingham on July 5, 2025. The original Black Sabbath lineup, Ozzy Osbourne, Tony Iommi, Geezer Butler, and Bill Ward performed together for the final time. Ozzy performed his own short set before joining Black Sabbath for the final bow. The city where the story began became the place where the original lineup said goodbye. 17 days later, Ozzy Osbourne died on July 22, 2025, at the age of 76. He had just taken his final bow with the band that made him famous. There is no need to turn that moment into mythology. The facts are already heavy enough. Born in Birmingham in 1948, Ozzy became one of the most recognizable voices in rock. He survived addiction, career collapse, reinvention, tragedy, and decades of change. And when his life ended, the world was left with something that had started more than half a century earlier. A band that changed what heavy music could sound like. What stays with me is not simply that Ozzy was fired and somehow came back. It is that Black Sabbath kept proving the same thing over and over again. People changed, voice changed, lineups changed, decades changed, but the idea survived. Sometimes losing the thing that defines you is what reveals who you actually are. Black Sabbath survived Ozzy. Ozzy survived Black Sabbath. And both became legends. Every legend lives behind a story. This one belongs in the archive.